Welcome everyone to the Gunzburg Center for European Studies. I'm Grzegorz Ekiert. I'm professor of government and director of the center, and this is director's seminar. And we are very fortunate today to have two colleagues who have been very important voices in and on East European politics for many years. As you are very well aware, Europe has been going through the number of very significant crises since 2008. That crisis has been acquiring many different dimensions, starting from economy, going to politics and migration, and so on and so on. But now we are facing another one. There is never a dull moment in Europe today, and this other big and coming crisis is the authoritarian shift within the European Union. And I think the stories of the last couple of weeks, with first Polish government trying to undermine the re-election of Donald Tusk as the president of European Council, and what is unfolding right now, the efforts of the Hungarian government to shut down the Central European University, are the sort of small moves in this very difficult news story unfolding. So we are very happy that we can have a conversation about those issues. And let me welcome Dr. Ivan Krastev. Ivan has been a renowned public intellectual and scholar for many years. He's the chairman of a Center for Liberal Strategies in Sofia in Bulgaria, and permanent fellow at the Institute for Human Sciences in Vienna, one of the most influential think tanks or centers for advanced studies in Europe. He's been a member of many different organizations and initiatives. He's, for example, on the Global Advisory Board of the Open Society Foundation, frequent contributor to debates on Eastern Europe for the last 3 decades, through Journal of Democracy, through New York Times editorials, and so on and so on. So really a very important presence in conversations about Eastern Europe. He's been publishing not only in journals but also books. Just the last couple of those books, Democracy Disrupted, The Global Politics of Protest in 2014, Mistrust We Trust, Can Democracy Survive When We Don't Trust Our Leaders in 2013, and his new book with the ominous title After Europe is going to come out in May. I always had this impression that Ivan was a little bit more pessimistic than most of us, but unfortunately he was always right. So that's something which we should admire. Now, after the talk, we'll have an opportunity to listen to a comment and discussion by Professor Kim Scheppele. Professor Scheppele is the visiting professor at the law school here at Harvard for this semester, and she is based at Princeton and is the Lawrence Rockefeller Professor of Sociology and International Affairs in Woodrow Wilson School. Again, this is one of the most important persons in our conversations about Eastern Europe. She has taught at Central European University in Budapest for several years, was the founder of some very important programs at this university, and her work focuses on the intersection of constitutional and international law, and she is investigating constitutions under stress, and now we have a lot of constitutions under stress in Central and Eastern Europe, so that field is growing. In her forthcoming book, she is going to work on counter-constitutions and this is the story about the tactics of authoritarian governments, which are forcing us to rethink various dimensions and aspects of constitutional theory. And of course, Kim published widely on many of those critical issues. So this is a great event. I'm so glad that Ivan and Kim could participate in it. And let me find the title for Ivan's talk, which is Perhapsburg: Reflections on the Fragility and Resilience of Europe. Ivan.
Thank you very much. First, I should be slightly excused on pessimism because there was a global survey that have been done and reported in The Economist that showed that Bulgarians are totally outliers when it comes to pessimism. So the title of the article which was covering this was "The Optimists, the Pessimists, and the Bulgarians." So when basically the pessimists and the optimists disagree, is the glass half full, half empty? Bulgarians, we believe that it's half broken. So from this point of view, this should be basically. Secondly, what I'll do is, and I'm really very much privileged to be invited here. It's very sincerely. I was here once talking to the Russian center, so I was being promoted to Europe, which is basically for Bulgaria. I'm going to talk and very much try to present you part of the argument of the book, which is going to be published in May. And this was a kind of a strange book because this was, for some years, we have been working with an American colleague, Stephen Combs, on a book on Russia. And then this European crisis started. And this is one of those books that you decide to write much more because you try for yourself to understand what is going on than that basically want to tell others. And here is the argument, because I really do, I'll try to make it brief so we can have a time to talk. For myself, I never was a specialist on European integration. So for most of the people here, if I have a much more expertise, it was much more on the disintegration side. I have certain research being done on how things collapse. I was very much interested in the Soviet collapse, in the Yugoslav collapse, so the political logic of collapse, in a different political regimes, was always very much interested me. And if you go and basically look at some of the major political projects that collapses, some of the best explanations for this you're going to find in fiction, not so much in the social science literature. If you want to understand how the Habsburg Empire collapsed, it's Joseph Roth's Radetzky March that is going to give you an idea of this. And there is a very particular moment in which a group of Habsburg officers, the most kind of loyal citizens or subjects of the emperor, sitting together, and then a telegram arrived with the rumor the Archduke Ferdinand has been killed. And at this moment, this group of officers from different nationalities, the empire, there is a kind of a huge tension, and one of the Hungarian officers starts talking Hungarian to his colleagues. The Slovenian officer starts to feel very uneasy. And he said, please, German only. And then the Hungarian said, I can say that in German too. Me and my colleagues, my co-nationals, we're happy that the bastard is gone. And this was the end of the empire, because this is exactly when kind of the German disappeared. Everybody goes on his national languages when you basically start to talk only to your own. And the major question was, is Europe basically experiencing something like this? To what extent the Brits getting out of the European Union? And listen, I'm not an economist, but in economic terms you should understand it's a big issue. This is as if 20 of the small countries has left. This is the economic impact of Britain leaving. This is a different economy. Also, we're not simply saying how the situation is. According to demographic projections, in 15, 20 years, Britain is going to be also the biggest European state if they had been staying there. So Brexit is not an accidental issue. It cannot be trivialized. Secondly, you have the rise of the Eurosceptic parties, and basically the mood has changed dramatically. I can imagine that if Marine Le Pen is going to be elected, this is going to be a major turning point. But when this crisis came and people start talking about European disintegration, comes the first question. We have a lot of theories of European integration, but we do not have a theory of European disintegration. And a colleague of ours, Jan Zelonka, was making this very clearly in his book, because the problem was the way the Europeans were treating disintegration is slightly the way the Supreme Court is treating pornography. We're going to recognize it when we see it. Because is it disintegration if some country leaves, or if some country leaves the Eurozone? Or is disintegration much more the normative issue, basically if you have the rise of illiberal regimes which are not sanctioned? Or is simply basically the decline of the European influence and the decline of the identification? So it's not easy to explain what disintegration means, particularly because the more we see the renationalization of politics, at the same time Europe is more integrated than ever, and not simply institutionally, but also because as a result of the crisis, Europeans are now much more interested in each other than ever before. There was never before that the ordinary German knew so much about Greek economy. And there was never, probably wrong things, but there was a genuine interest. And there was never before that the Poles and the Hungarians knew so much about the German Sicilian politics. So the crisis is producing this understanding of a shared fate, which is very strong. And in a certain way, you have this paradox. But when I was reflecting, and what I have learned basically from this studying of disintegration, and it's not a discovery of mine, you're going to see it in a lot of writing, is that this was true in the case of Soviet Union, it was true in the case of Yugoslavia. These big projects, they do not disintegrate simply because you're going to have an anti-European majority in Europe. In a certain way, the political logic of disintegration is the logic of a run on a bank. At some point, governments and people start to believe that the project is not going to survive. And as a result of it, they start to adopt policies which is going to optimize their chances in the case that the project fails. But by doing this, they're strongly increasing the process of disintegration. So from this point of view, disintegration in a certain way very often is unintended consequence. It is not simply the result of the fact that anti-European forces are going to prevail over the pro-European forces. The second thing is also quite interesting and could be seen both in the Yugoslav and in the Soviet cases. You cannot disintegrate a big political project from the periphery. Bulgaria is not going to disintegrate the European Union, nevertheless, of what we're doing. Disintegration most normally is the revolt of the center. It was not the Baltics who ran away of the Soviet Union that put the end of the Soviet project. It was the decision of the Russian Federation that they don't have an interest in the Soviet project anymore in this moment that it happened. So from this point of view, France and Germany are the ones that we should basically really look at to understand what is happening. But when I was trying to make this argument, I figured out that the divisions of Europe are not simply between small states, big states, north-south, because all of the crises are coming and producing different type of divides. But there is one divide which is very interesting, and this is based on the experience. One of the major differences between East and West in experiencing this crisis is that all of us in Eastern Europe have disintegration in our personal experience of a major political system. This was not a disintegration that we're unhappy with, but we realize how fragile everything political is, and how something that was totally unthinkable yesterday is perceived as inevitable today. And this is not on the level of culture, ideology, interests. This is simply that you have gone through this. In the late 80s, communist system in Bulgaria was stable as the Vitusha mountain, which is next to Sofia. You can like it or dislike it, but it was forever. And then it took weeks. I'm just anecdotally, the story is the day when Todor Zhivkov resigned, There was kind of a drinking in the restaurant of Sofia University, and then the leader of the opposition, there was no opposition, but the first democratic president, Scheppele, was telling to some of us, we had been students then, he said, "You're young people, you're going to see the end of communism." 6 months later, he was the president of the country. So this idea of a time, the idea of a moment, this integration is a moment, and it's such a radical moment. Everything is happening so quickly that I do believe that this understanding of how fragile everything is very different, and major difference between East and West. Westerners do not have this sense of fragility in their personal experience. And this is why East and West are going to react differently, exactly based on this type of a shaping experience of how stable or unstable political projects are. So when I was doing this, I decided to focus basically, and this is what I'll do today, just on three issues. The first is on the dramatic, profound change the refugee crisis has on the European politics. I know this it's very difficult to explain, particularly you are following Europe, you're in the European center, but when you talk to people who are not following Europe, they're slightly strange, because what happened in Europe was nothing dramatic in terms. Just to give you something simple, there are less people who entered Europe even in 2015-16 than the one that went to Turkey. Turkey being a much smaller place and so on, so it was not the numbers. But as the effect on politics, the refugee crisis has the same dramatic effect of remaking politics in the way 9/11 has on the American politics. Because also, from the point of view of the terrorist threat, 9/11 was not the end of the world. But it totally changed the way the population thinks about the future, about their political system, and I do believe that the refugee crisis was Europe's 9/11, and it produced, from this point of view, I do believe that migration in general, and I'm going to use the refugee and migration here as a synonymous, nevertheless, that they are not, because in the public imagination they functioned like this. I'm saying this because there's three things that basically became immediately obvious when this talk happened, and it was a very much suppressed talk, because if you're going to reread now The End of History, I mean the essay which Fukuyama published, you're going to see something interesting. There is a lot of talk about the free floating of ideas. They're going to see a lot about the free floating of goods and capitals. In the article, the word migration was not mentioned. So ideas are going to travel, goods are going to travel, capitals are going to travel, but people are going to stay. And suddenly, we realize that it's going to be the movement of people and not the movement of ideas that in a certain way is going to remake our world. And this is going to happen because as a result of globalization, and Hannah Arendt noticed it already in the 1970s, that for the first time we have a common present, two important things has happened. And just to give you an illustration, in 1981, when the World Values Survey for the first time was done by the Engelhardt and basically the Michigan colleagues, it showed up that there was no strong positive correlations between economic well-being and happiness. In 1981, the West Germans were as happy as Nigerians, or the other way around. Nigerians were as happy as West Germans. 20 years later, this was not true. 20 years later, there was a very strong positive correlations between economic well-being and happiness. And what has changed basically is that the Nigerians got television. So they simply know how the West Germans live. One of the major things that the globalization produces, it changed the frames of comparisons. If till yesterday you have been comparing yourself with the life of your parents or with your neighbors, now you have the dictatorship of the global comparisons. You're comparing yourself with the people that are living better and best in the world. In this type of an environment, the most radical thing that you can do is not to change your government, but to change your country. And from this point of view, the migration is the revolution of the 21st century, but not in the way some of radical left theories believe, not because the migrants are the new proletariat. It's a very individualistic, it's family-driven, but it's a radical change within one generation. And don't forget that the strongest predicator for how much money you're going to have in your life is not your education or the education of your parents, but where you were born. And from this point of view, you have migration, which is becoming a major political movement, but at the moment Europeans realize this, they realize that Europe is the major counter-revolutionary force. Because in a certain way, what is happening is that at the heart of the liberal philosophy in which European Union is built, there is a very strong contradiction. In order for the liberalism to work, either people are going to have the universal citizenship, nevertheless of where they are born, or the countries in the world should be so equally in their prosperity and freedom that people are not going to have a motivation to move. And we don't have both. Neither the countries like this or going to be like this in 15 or 20 years, nor Europe was ready to basically accept and integrate all these people. As a result of it, my suggestion is that migration crisis from this point of view should be really taken seriously. It cannot be reduced to the movement of people and the economic impact of this. Migration crisis is also a major movement of voters. We'll basically see a major shift of voters to the far right. One of the major things is particularly the movement of the blue-collar workers, which traditionally have been voting for the social democratic parties in Europe to the far right. The movement of arguments. In the 1970s, it was the left saying that local communities in India have the right to resist globalization in order to protect their way of life. Now they're conservative parties saying that the middle-class societies in the West have the right to defend their way of life and basically to resist foreigners to come. This is also basically also the change of identities. What migration crisis change is the relations between Europe and future. Europeans started to fear future. And in political terms also, the migration crisis opened and returned the divide between East and West in a dramatic way. If you see the reaction of the German society, Austrian society, and I'm not trying, to be honest, moralized on this, as you're going to see, but there was a major difference. Not that German society is not totally divided, but our societies were not divided on migration. Our society was totally unified on migration. And there was no major difference between Catholic Poland and Orthodox Bulgaria or Hungary or the Czech Republic. You had 80, 85, 90% of the population. Major consensus between the political parties is that the refugees are not welcomed. Why this came up? Because I do believe it's very easily to start and say, listen, this is Europeans. But it's much more complicated because this type of a reaction, first, it is quite strange because if you see at Eastern Europe, we have been migrating all the time and also we have been receiving quite a lot of migrants. In the 1920s, after the Balkan Wars and the World War I, Bulgaria has refugees that have been 1/3 of its population, and it managed to do it. The difference is that they were Bulgarians. So you don't have a deficit of solidarity, you have a clash of solidarities. While in the West, there was a much more cosmopolitan idea of what solidarity means, that you have a kind of empathy with those more vulnerable parts of the world. The refugee crisis basically pushed many East Europeans to believe that the only way to survive is having solidarity with your own tribe, your own people. And this has also something to do with the history of Central and Eastern Europe. If you look, and here the historians who are going to put it much more nicer than me. But basically one of the things that happened in Eastern Europe after the World War II, and this was one of the major sources of the legitimacy of the communist regime, it was an ethnic homogenization of societies. In 1939, 1/3 of the population of Poland were non-Poles. Germans, Ukrainians, Jews. Now probably more than 95% of the population of Poland are Poles. The idea of multiculturalism for many of this society goes back to the previous imperial period, and this is associated with time of trouble. not with time of success. And unlike some of the intelligentsia, which was nostalgic for the Habsburg period and others, Tony Judd is making a very strong argument showing that it's very difficult to be a cosmopolitan and be a good Pole or good Bulgarian or good Hungarian because the very idea of the national identity in these countries was on opposition of some cosmopolitan center. It could be the church, it could be the empire. And also this is also the major difference. The communist system was very internationalist. So part of the anti-communist sentiment was also very much based on opposing the communist imposed cosmopolitanism. There are also two other factors that I want to stress out because I will not go basically to go very much on this, but one which is totally underestimated is the demographic fears. Bulgaria is now 7.5 million people living in the country. Around 10% of the population has left in the last 25 years. According to the UN projection, in the next 30 years, the country is going to lose 27% of its population. It's one of the most aging population. The impact of the refugee crisis created this kind of a shock and fear of disappearance. In 100 years, we're not going to be around anymore. Nobody's going to speak Bulgarian. They're not going to be Bulgarians. And this is true for everybody. I'm giving Bulgarian example because I know better, but it's not much different in many of these places. The relations between demography and democracy is one of the least studied things. Because democracy starts with the idea of a political community which is taken for granted. And from this point of view, you can enlarge it, you can redefine it, but basically it starts from somewhere. And then basically this society started totally to fear that there is no place for them. The second thing, particularly in countries like Bulgaria and Romania, was the failure to integrate the Roma population. And this is a dramatic failure. I mean, if there is excluded group in our countries, this is it. Made basically all these foreigners coming to look as the new Roma. And the idea of how we cannot integrate people that have been with us for centuries and we're going to integrate those foreigners that are coming from outside was very much kind of used. And here I'm talking about a genuine sentiment which was not just the rhetoric of the nationalistic leaders because we have a lot of it, because we have a lot of mobilization and so on, but it's very easy to reduce what happened to the misuse of the fears of the public by political leaders. My major argument is that this was not simply an empty fears. There was something existentially troubling, and these people, of course, overworked it and tried to make it political resource. So doing this story, I just want to make two additional on migration, which is also quite important in the book. Migration made Europeans question everything that they have been enjoying before. Even today, if you're going to ask East Europeans, at least Bulgarians, what is the best thing that 1989 gave you, it was the open borders. Now, what is the thing that you really fear? It's the open borders. This is why for European Union we don't have a language, because the best and the worst is the same. The opening of society is something that we really this was the message, but this is also what we fear very much today. And secondly, some of the key concepts that the last 25 years have been put into question, one of them being human rights. Because the refugee crisis, very much not only legally, but politically, have been framed in the terms of the human rights. And one of the major stories about human rights and why this was so powerful discourse was that, unlike many other policies, the human rights policy cannot be dependent on the capacity of the state. When it comes to the fundamental rights, and this is why many people don't want to put the economic rights there, because they said economic rights cannot be divorced from the capacity of the state. But then comes the story. If you have the obligation to protect people who are under persecution, is this the obligation to basically get anybody who wants to come? And I'm talking about legitimately. is the capacity of state matters. Is the argument we cannot, for example, Bulgaria cannot integrate 1 million. Not that 1 million are coming. I'm giving the theoretical argument. Is this a legitimate argument or not? And I'm saying this that as a result of this crisis, the human rights discourse simply disappeared, which was a human rights issue, have been totally transformed into a security issue. So now any migrant or refugee coming on the Bulgarian border is framed as the instrument of Erdogan or Turkish policy to destabilize the country. In the case of Hungary and Orban, basically this is made as part of the new grand strategy. But this type of a transformation is going to have a much far-reaching consequences also for many other things. If 5 or 10 years ago, Europeans were sure that the spread of democracy was in Europe's interest, now I do believe if there's going to be a referendum, and even not in Bulgaria, but in Italy, to resurrect Gaddafi because he can stop the refugee wave, many Italians are going to vote for this. I'm giving you this argument because I just wanted to tell you that in the way 9/11, which at the end of the day was a terrorist attack in which 3,000 people died, this is not the worst thing happening to your country, managed to change many of the assumptions of the American public of what's happening to the world, and I do believe we can see the political consequences, also how people have been voting and so on. This is the refugee crisis that had the same impact on the European Union, European project, not only institutionally, but basically on the imagination of the public. And here, trying to move slightly forward, and this is really going to be very brief, and trying to understand basically how this is functioning, I'm making one major argument, and this is that what is going to be surprise for many is that if till now, for the last 25 years, at least in Eastern Europe, but for a longer period before, democracy functioned as an instrument for inclusion, the same democratic institutions and the same democratic proceedings are going to function as the instrument for exclusion. In a certain way, we're going to have a shift to majoritarianism, democratic majoritarianism. And basically, it's not, from this point of view, this is not a revolt against democracy. It's something which, in my view, is more profound and in a certain way can be much more dangerous. It's a redefinition of democracy and the institutions of democracy to serve basically the purpose of creating majoritarian regimes that try to keep communities closed. So in order to understand how this works, I basically focused on 3 paradoxes. One is the Central European paradox. It has 2 points. I'm just going to give you one of it, and this is the following. In Eastern Europe, and Poland is my major example, people are quite mistrustful to political elite. If you read the opinion poll, this is consistent. Why then people who are mistrustful of politicians and political leaders are ready to support party which is dismantling the check and balances system, which is putting in question the separation of powers and basically is allowing the concentration of power in the hands of one party and one person. And here is my kind of a troubling finding in this book. If theoretically we are convinced that the system of the check and balances function as an instrument for accountability and basically not allowing the governments to do wrong things, from the point of view of many ordinary voters, the system of the separation of power and check and balances started to function as alibi for the elites not to deliver to the people what they have promised. The way basically the governments were telling, I cannot do it because of the courts, I cannot do it because of the European Union, I cannot do it because of the markets, created a situation in which people said the only way to keep basically leaders accountable is to give them the whole power so he cannot have excuses. The only problem with this is that you can give them the whole power, you cannot be sure that they're going to return it to you. But this is a logic which, to be honest, I found also in some of the data coming from the United States. Paradoxically, the most authoritarian-minded, let's use this, part of the American voters is not the far right, but in a certain way is a certain type of a centrist vote when it comes to issue. But these people are so disappointed with the dysfunctional polarized system that as a reaction to political polarization, they jumped and are ready to support authoritarian solution. So this is strangely enough authoritarianism of the center, which I find very problematic, and from this Eastern Europe is very interesting. The other thing that is extremely interesting about this new situation is that it's not so much classical ideologies, but conspiracy theories that are starting to create the political identities of these parties. The strongest predicator for who voted for the governing party in Poland is not the church attendance, is not incomes or education, but it is the belief that what happened in Smolensk was an assassination and not an accident. When the plane of the president of the republic and 100 members of the Polish elite died going for the anniversaries of Katyn. I'm saying this because there is one very important difference between ideologies and conspiracy theories. Ideologies, good or bad, has a normative part. Ideological person does not like people in the way they are, but in the way they could be. They have a different idea how we want to remake the people. Catholic Church has one idea how the new man should like, and the communist has a totally different. But there is a normative part, and plus there is always a future dimension. Conspiracy theories, you're either in or out. It's a club. You cannot criticize a conspiracy theory from the position of the ideal. There is no ideal there. Basically, either you're subscribing for this or not. So for me, this is quite important to go with these changes, because what struck me in Central and Eastern Europe, and particularly in a very interesting and vibrant society like Poland, it's not that somebody tried to dismantle the check and balances, that a big part of the population was ready to go with this. There are people who resisted. In the case of Hungary, I don't believe even we can say this actively when it happened. And I do believe that there is a fundamental reason for this, which was important for me. The second is what I'm going to say called the West European paradox. And the West European paradox is that if you read the literature, people are going to tell you, particularly after Brexit, that the younger generation is much more pro-European than the older generation. By the way, this is not true in all countries. If you see the voting base of Marine Le Pen, she's overperforming between 24 and 40. This is the strongest part of these voters. But in general, the younger voters are more pro-European, and on a certain way they're much more politically active. Why they are not saving Europe from below? And here I'm developing very much the idea that there is certain important part of this youth political activism which we saw for the last 5 or 6 years, and it's very strong anti-institutional nature. And there is a colleague who is teaching here in MIT, and she has, in my view, a beautiful metaphor to try to understand these movements. She's saying, have you noticed how many more people are dying in the Himalaya these days, trying to get to the Everest? Why this is happening? Because of the new equipment and others, everybody has the feeling that they can go to the Everest. But going to the Everest is not an easy story. So part of the effect of the new social media and technology is that all these social movements are picking up too early before having to create organizational capacity. And paradoxically, on one level, they're empowering in the short term, but on the other, they're creating organizationally very weak and vulnerable movements which easily collapse. And if you see, after all these talks about horizontal structures and about this type of an activism, the only two parties, particularly from the left, that came with these movements, I mean Syriza and Podemos, they're quite old-fashioned on their organizational terms. I'm not touching on their ideology. But for example, one of the major stories in Spain was that it's a leaderless protests. When Podemos for the first time was running, they have the picture of the leader of the Iglesias on the ballot. So from probably this is not the definition of a leaderless movement. And as a result of it, I'm saying that as a result of this political activism cannot be used for building a pan-European movement, exactly because of this total mistrust to institutions, but also very much this focus on spontaneous and from this point of view, a local part of it. The third part of the argument, and I'm very quickly going to the end, is what I'm calling the Brussels paradox. And the Brussels paradox is also very simple. It probably has something to do with places like Harvard. And the question is the following. Why parents who are going to give all their money to send their kids to study in places like Harvard are not allowing to be governed by people who have graduated Harvard. Why the meritocratic elites are so mistrusted? And when I say meritocratic elites, I'm particularly stressing on the elites that made their success very much based on education and giving exams. You can see this also in the United States. In a certain way, Tea Party people does not have a huge problem with the very wealthy people. But if the wealth comes from Ivy League schools and networking and so on, they find this highly problematic. And I do believe that there is something very important on this, and this goes with the idea that European project was very much based on the idea of the meritocratic society. But Michael Young, the British sociologist who 50 years ago introduced the idea of meritocratic society, already, he made a point which in my view now is critically important. Meritocratic societies are very unequal societies because the distance between the winner and the losers are very clear. But what is even more important, they create the winners that do not feel sorry for the losers, because in a certain way we all went to exams. I did my exams, you didn't do yours. Why I should care about you? And from this point of view, you create also an elites, and this is part of the European story, which are very mobile. And the mobility of the elites is something that in this meritocratic milieu is very highly appreciated. From the point of view of the voter, it looks that meritocratic elites in the time of crisis has an exit, while the public does not have. So you're going to see now the rise of people who do not speak foreign languages and insisting that they don't speak foreign language as the way to be elected. They cannot go to Brussels, they cannot become commissioners, they cannot be hired by Goldman Sachs. So from this point of view, the idea that I'm going to with you till the end, we're going to be together in this, is becoming a major source of legitimacy. And from this point of view, the populist parties and the meritocrats, they have two different metaphors what is a society. For the meritocratic elite, society is like a school. You go there, we have equal opportunities, some schools are better than others, and as a result of it, you should give exams and you should be basically treated on the basis of your performance. Populists go with the metaphor of society as a family. Nevertheless, how you're doing, you're part of the family. It's not about deserving or not deserving, you're one of us. And this idea of a society as a family is, of course, getting a lot of political traction, particularly when the very idea of political community is challenged. So I'm ending with the question where my pessimism leads me to. And this is going to be some small, slightly more optimistic end. After Europe does not mean that European Union necessarily is going to collapse, because as we agree, we don't know exactly what it means. I do believe that certain idea of Europe and certain idea of the future has been dramatically challenged, and we cannot simply go back to it. It has something to do with demography. It has something to do with a global realignment of power on a global level. If 5 or 10 years ago, Europe believes that we're the laboratory of the future and that the world is going to look like us, what yesterday was perceived as universal now is perceived as exceptional. We don't believe that Indians, Chinese, and I'm even not talking about Russians, Turks, and all others are going to copy our model. But does it mean that the European Union is not going to, should collapse in the way basically Marine Le Pen is saying this? I'm also not sure in this. First, because none of these countries can imagine also their future outside of the EU. In a certain way, the only one who can do it, they did it, and this was the United Kingdom, but it's an island. For the others, and this is quite interesting, 2016 was very painful for the European Union, not simply because kind of things that we don't like happened, but we're not prepared for them. First was Brexit. Almost everybody expected it's not going to happen. Then Trump was a major surprise with a major geopolitical implications, because Donald Trump is the first American president, which for reasons that I don't want now to discuss, does not believe that preservation of the European Union is in the strategic interest of the United States. He thinks very much in the trade terms and not in security terms. If you think in trade terms, is it better to have negotiations with a big trade area like the EU, or you prefer to have a trade deal with all of these small countries one by one? Then asymmetrically you're going to do better. 2017 could be slightly different because now everybody has an apocalyptic expectations. The first was Netherlands is going to have a populist prime minister. It didn't happen. And now people believe that Marine Le Pen most probably is going to do it. She could do it, but she could also not do it. And in Germany, even if there's going to be a change of a government, it's not change of the consensus in Germany. And my optimistic argument is people underestimate to what extent the capacity to survive is at the sources of legitimacy of any political project. Surviving is a very important way of basically being legitimate. So you cannot expect that the European Union is going to be radically reformed in the next 2 or 3 years, but this does not mean that the European Union is not going to survive, and also you don't know who are going to be what kind of political leaders can save it, and this is my last story. There is a beautiful book which I'm strongly recommending to all of you who have time to read something which is not just research related. It's called Anatomy of a Moment. It is a Spanish book about the failed 1981 coup attempt in Spain. As you know, the National Guard lieutenant comes with his soldiers. It's the Spanish parliament, and he said, everybody on the floor. And this is documented, by the way. There was a film of this, so this is not. And members of parliament go on the floor, but 3 of them did not go on the floor. Nevertheless, that he's saying that he's going to shoot them, and this psychologically changed the situation. Of course, the king also played some positive role. These 3 are the most unlikely people that you believe are going to stand for democracy in Spain. One was the Prime Minister Suarez, who was a Franco functionary and so on, who didn't devote it all his life to fighting for democracy. The other was the Minister of Defense, who was a Franco general, who during the Civil War basically had been fighting for Franco. The third was the leader of the Spanish Communist Party, which basically was fighting and saying that democracy is just a facade for almost all his political career. But these 3 did not go on the floor. And because they didn't go on the floor, and the soldiers were afraid to shoot them, basically this idea of it's over went there. So this is my the optimistic end of my pessimistic talk. And this is that, as German poet Rilke said, who speaks for victory? To endure is all.
Thank you very much. Kim, please.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Ivan, for such a provocative talk. And I might say that I did have a chance to look at the page proofs of this book, and it's just extraordinary. And the talk gives you some sense of it, but I really want to recommend the book when it comes out in 2 weeks after your...
Follow the advice.
Yeah, no, it's great. Perhaps I'm going to play the character by being American. But I should say I've spent, much of the last 25 years trying to be a Hungarian in my soul, so I have a basically depressive aspect in here too. But I want to be somewhat more optimistic. I guess I want to try to set up a debate and sort of see how we might sort of interact around some evidence to the contrary. And so what I'm struck by, I have the great good fortune this term of teaching European law at the law school, and it's been really fun because I've never been able to teach it before, and like everyone in the room who's taught knows that the first time you teach a course, you're discovering all these things that you didn't know because you were only looking at some particular piece, of your subject. So what I'm struck by is, first of all, how crisis talk has permeated the entire, EU's development from the beginning. People thought in 1965 that when de Gaulle didn't show up at European Council meetings for a year, that the entire thing would fall apart, and now nobody even teaches that, actually. So there have been other moments where it looked like the European project was going to fail, and somehow it doesn't fail, or rather, it might slow down, it might speed up, it gets lumpy, there are some strange things that go into the mix. Extremely hard to explain European law, except historically, how it kind of evolves. But I'm beginning to think that we may actually be at a point in the European Union where we have so many crises that some crises are going to start to fix other crises. So let me give you a few examples, because it actually turns out to be a little bit magical, right? So one is the refugee crisis, which, as Ivan said, has really posed really starkly this East-West difference. It's really divided the homogeneous from the pluralistic states. It really looks like a kind of identity crisis. And yet, One of the things it's done is if you look at where the refugees wanted to go and where they've wound up, they've by and large gone to the countries, particularly Germany and Sweden, which were running budget surpluses. And what every economist was saying for years is that the way you fix the euro crisis is to stimulate the economy. And my colleague Paul Krugman at Princeton, my next door neighbor with whom I've sort of worked on some of these things, used to say, well, look, if we could just get Germany and Sweden to spend 2% more of GDP on something, we'd fix the euro crisis, right? So now actually Germany's spending about 2% of GDP. Sweden's about up to 3% of GDP. Who guessed they would spend it on Syrians? Didn't want to spend it on Greeks, but they'll spend it on Syrians. But from an economic standpoint, it doesn't actually matter what they've spent it on. And if you'll notice, the Greeks are about to make yet another deal to get yet another bargain and without yet another debt relief and so forth. And they're limping on, but it's not the same kind of crisis it was 2 years ago. And some of that is because actually, unemployment is starting to come down. The stimulus is starting to work. We may be actually, in some sense, stimulating our way out of the euro crisis by having some of the generous states spend money on Syrians. That's just one strange example. Okay, so let me give you a couple of others because it's not just that one example. So for many people, Brexit's the end of the world. We're going to go from 28 to 27. We've never gotten smaller. This is really a huge crisis. But again, having just taught now the history of the European Union, what you realize is that ever since the UK has gotten into the EU, it's been a pain in the neck, right? And think of all the things the EU might have done if the UK wasn't there. And so what you're starting to see, as people have kind of gotten out of their defensive crouch and are starting to think ahead to what comes after Brexit, there are two big ideas that are starting to be discussed as not impossible, but that were things you could never talk about with Britain in the room, right? So one is the idea of the social state. Right? There's been this idea that Europe should stand not just for sort of neoliberal economic policy, but that you needed to balance it with some kind of redistributive policies coming from the EU to the state level. And now people are starting to talk about bringing back the social state. Well, what's the source of a lot of the discontent in Europe? It's exactly the growing inequality made possible by the fact that Britain blocked the ability of all of the other states in the EU, which would have strongly supported a social state, from actually ever bringing those ideas up to the European level. Now it's starting to be discussed. Think about another thing that Brexit, I'm really sorry for my UK friends, and this is not meant to gloat over your misery, but it's just to say that there may be a silver lining somewhere. The other thing that Brexit may bring us is actually a solution to the North-South problem. So if you think of the euro, as the refugees, the euro crisis solves the East-West problem, we also have a solution in Brexit to the North-South problem. So if you think about, one of the anxieties that's been brought about by the Eurozone crisis is that it looks like Germany's punishing Greece, right? And everybody has personalized it by country. That you got the tough countries like the Netherlands and Germany, and then you've got the needy countries, and it's this kind of. And part of the reason why European fights are set up that way is because another thing that the UK blocked was the inability of Europe to raise any resources or really substantial taxes on its own. Right? So one proposal that's been on the table for years that nobody could talk about that suddenly is becoming speakable is that what the EU needs is its own resources. Those of you who know American history may remember the debate over the national income tax, which was not possible until the Constitution was amended. And it really changes things if you have a sort of quasi-federal or federal system where most of your money isn't coming from direct member state contributions, right, but is coming from some other source. And so there's been an idea, for example, of a European income tax, or corporate tax, rather, which would prevent some of the race to the bottom stuff that we're seeing in Luxembourg and Ireland. Let's see how they think about that. But still, that was unthinkable because the UK said no, no, no. There was also a financial transactions tax, right? Sort of every time you take advantage of the fact that there's kind of a common banking system, or more or less a common banking system, you pay a little tax for that because you're getting a benefit. Again, this could be an enormous source of funds. Britain always vetoed it because of the city. So if Brexit actually results in certain topics not being shouted down from the moment that they're raised, it could actually mean that nobody can tell whose EU resources are whose anymore, And when you have asymmetric shocks in the Eurozone, there'll be a fund to draw from that isn't just what the member states have contributed. And I could go on, but I think that sort of gives you a sense that this may be this moment when things are so badly wrong that you can start to leverage one disaster to fix another one. Okay, that's my first sort of point of optimism. The second point of optimism actually goes exactly, I was thinking as I was reading Ivan's book and hearing his talk, that memory is immensely important, I mean, everywhere. It's especially important in Europe, and it's especially important in Eastern Europe. But, we've now been through so many shocks, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, but also with the rise of the EU, with the fading of World War II memory as the anchor for why we have the European project. That we now have a different set of memories that are grounding people's experience with Europe. And in particular, we now have a set of people who cannot remember the days when there wasn't the Erasmus program, the Euro, Schengen borders, European citizenship. In other words, there are people who just assume that all of Europe is just a borderless zone, that it's easy to move, that if you speak languages, you can do anything, and increasingly things are in an increasingly smaller number of languages, so it's clearer how you can move. And so there are people for whom that's an unthinkable thing to stop. Okay, now what that suggests, and what Ivan said, is that, of course, there are some countries where the majority of young people are actually not cosmopolitans. That's certainly true if you interview Hungarian university students. Among Hungarian university students right now, the most popular party is Jobbik, which is the far-right party. But that's a selection bias. That's because the Orban government has made it so expensive to go to university in Hungary. Hungary is now the most expensive country in the world to go to university if you compare tuitions to local salaries. The Economist reported that last year, and I thought, oh my goodness, right, of course. All the students who speak languages are going to Germany, or they're going somewhere else, which means the ones you've got left behind are all the ones who don't speak languages. And so it's really a selection bias, and I suspect that may be true in some of these other surveys, that selectively the ones who are moving and not available to be interviewed are actually the nationalists left behind. So what that suggests is actually that you've got a generation that now would find it unthinkable not to have this. You may not find them in any polls because they're moving around a lot, so polls may not be the best indicator. But what it also tells you is that where the splits are in Europe are within countries, not so much between them. That every country is reproducing the same fight. So when we talk about a country, like I spend, in my mind, I'm in Hungary every day, or you look at Poland, it's not that the whole country believes what the government believes. These are divided populations. One of the reasons why governments like the PiS government in Poland and the Fidesz government in Hungary have had to resort to such brutal tactics was that they could very well have lost the next election if they didn't actually resort to that stuff, which is to say that there were other people with other ideas in the space. So I guess what I'm saying is that I think what we're seeing is every country has a rising nationalist and sort of populist movement. Every country has a Eurosceptical piece, but every country's fighting the same battle, which suggests a European solution, right? Which is to say, every country's got to figure out what to do with this. So I think that ultimately is going to bolster European competencies to deal with this kind of thing. And then finally, I guess the last remark I want to make is about this democratic majoritarianism, which is really one of the things that has gotten many of us worried as we see one referendum after another go the wrong direction. We haven't even talked about the Dutch referendum on Ukraine, for example, and the Hungarian referendum on migration. Increasingly, sort of populist leaders are sort of turning to these plebiscites where they get these kind of bad results. And the question is, so what does that tell us? So one thing about democracy, if you look at over the grand scheme of democracy's developments over the last couple of centuries, what you realize is that there's this very strong association between the breadth of the electorate and the narrowness of the things they're allowed to decide. And this is really true in Europe. National governments are mostly controlling symbolic issues. I mean, important things like education and national holidays and which languages you speak and so on. But the EU now controls basically everything in the economy. The European Court of Human Rights is putting at least a floor on what governments can do in the area of human rights. There are basically so many things that are controlled by external bargains and promises that the space within which democratic governments operate has become not exclusively the space of the symbolic, but that tends to be a lot of the content of what national government is. And so it's not surprising that you get these kind of lightning rod and very pitched debates over whether you have a statue to this person or that person on the lawn of the parliament, right? But in some level, that's probably not going to be where people's lives are constructed. And so I think what you see is that in some sense, governments can get into less trouble than they used to at the national level because they're so imbricated, especially in the EU, but also more broadly speaking in a kind of international web in which kind of holds you from falling too far. And so what we see is that, if you take, again, Poland and Hungary to take the two, bad boys in the East, neither one of them is really talking seriously about leaving the EU. And the fact is, they can't. In Hungary, 6% of GDP comes from structural funds. It right now it has been ever since the Orban government came to power, the largest source of incoming money to invest in anything. And so they can't give it up. So I think that we have to start looking at the difference between rhetoric and reality, not that rhetoric isn't a kind of reality and not that it doesn't matter, but that at some level, all these governments are kind of hemmed in by the fact that economically speaking, they would collapse if they followed through on their threats. And so I hate to say this because, I work in comparative constitutionalism. I always think I can fix things through law. But ultimately, if governments do badly enough on law, their economies fall apart, and that's what kills them. And so just look at Venezuela as one example, or to some extent Russia under these sanctions, or when the oil prices fall. That I hate to, I sound like a materialist, perhaps I'm a materialist. Maybe this is the return of materialism in an environment where it doesn't quite mean the same thing. But a lot of these democratic politics are as toxic as they are for the same reasons why we used to say faculty meetings were as toxic as they are. You fight so hard because there's so little at stake, right? And again, not to trivialize it, but I think that if the EU can't disappear, because then the safety net is gone and then everything changes. And I think that many people, when push comes to shove, will realize that. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I think it's a very interesting debate being laid down in front of us on many very different issues. Let me ask the first question before we bring our colleagues and friends from the audience. Namely, the question is about time and legacies. I think that we tend to think about what is going on in Europe today, referring back to Euro crisis. So we are sort of moving back 9 years. Somehow finding that moment was a critical one, where suddenly legitimacy of the European Union and this kind of promise suddenly fall apart. And then we moved like 2 years back and say, well, it's that migration from Syria which created this and that. And I'm thinking about, where things went wrong, and I'm going back to the debates we had at the beginning of the transition. As you all remember very well, everyone was very pessimistic, right? Someone who sounded like Balcerowicz or Sachs, everyone looked at them and said, what's wrong with those guys, right? They don't realize what's going on. Mm-hmm. And I think that there were two elements in this debate which I think are worth remembering, right? The first debate was this ridiculous idea that the communist system somewhat worked like a refrigerator. Right? So there were those very traditional communities in Eastern Europe, very religious, very closed from the world for centuries. And then the communists came and froze it down. The modernization which happened under the communist rule was very artificial. They built factories, built those big buildings and so on and so on. But really those people have not changed, right? And then came 89, and it was this kind of unfreezing process going on, and those communities started to sort of proceed as if there was no modernization. So I thought that in certain way this is the story of the last 25 years, that we at certain point started to believe, 10 years ago, that how easy it is to modernize Eastern Europe. And suddenly we keep discovering that there are those religious fanatics, running around and this and that, anti-Semites, people wearing uniforms of the most nasty organization. So there is something about cultural modernization which creates problems. On the material front, it was very easy, right? The sneakers and labels and nice cars. This went very easy. People adopted that. But when they started to see the gay parades and the other things, suddenly they had problem with this. So this is about those traditional communities which did not have chance to modernize, and that brings me to one more point about it. We were thinking at the beginning of the transition that those different moments, that the different processes operate according to different clocks. You remember very influential Ralph Dahrendorf story, right? That it's easy to change the constitution, easy to change the law. It will take 3 generations to build civil society. But I think he forgot about the cultural dimension of the story, right? Because it doesn't take 3 generations to build the civil society as a set of organizations, but it takes 5 generations really to have a cultural modernization which would allow this. So the point is, do we need to go back and rethink the start of the transition, or even the experiences under the communist rule, if we want to understand really what is going on now in Poland and Hungary? So that's my question.
Thank you very much. First, I'm so sorry that I didn't wait for this debate before to finish the book, because the optimistic part is going to be much more convincing. You are not a real Hungarian, because I had a Hungarian colleague, when I told him that he's very pessimistic, he said, no, even pessimism does not work in Hungary.
Right, it's true.
But because I want to basically to respond to both, there is one thing, and here there is the political kind of scientist. There is a time dimension. What you are saying is very convincing, under the argument that basically the timing of this crisis is going to be enough. I have a small piece in the book on who is going to kill the union if it's killed. And it's going to be a series of a small and totally idiotic referenda. But not this in and out, but exactly like the Dutch referendum on Ukraine, the Orban referendum on the refugees and others, because the basic problem is European Union is a space of negotiations. Referendums do not negotiate with each other. Both governments and populist forces basically jump on the referendum in order to solve the local crisis of democracy. But the more you're doing this is the funny story which you're going to figure out if you're studying Soviet and Yugoslav collapse. You have forgotten that they died by referendums. And Soviets died even by the referendums that they won. In March 1991, in 9 of the Soviet republics, there was a referendum for the Union, and they won the referendums. But the basic problem with the referendum is the very moment you have a national referendum, you focus the center of politics on the national issues. And from this, because I do believe you made a really, and I as you told you, first normatively, I'm very strongly pro-EU, so this is not a piece of a Eurosceptic, but I do believe for me the timing issue is critical. So this is like this old quadrille dance, very popular in the end of the 19th century, where you all the time are changing the partner, like the Europe is changing the crisis, but at the end of the day, you took one of the partners home. So it's very important with which of the crises Europe will go home. And here comes the time issue. I very much agree with you. One of my hypotheses about the governments like Orban and Kaczynski, which is in the book, is that we should look at them as the second generation of migrants. Because what happened basically to Eastern Europe is that Eastern Europe migrated to the West in the period of 25 years. Some people did it individually, but most migrated with their own countries. And you have this very clear generation, a very clear problem well described by sociologists, what's happened to the second generation of migrants. While the first generation people like Havel and Michnik and others, for them basically adopting to this European modernity was perceived like success. The second generation in a way is more Europeanized in many respects. But they basically start to experience the limits of integration, the idea of the second-class citizenship. They start to go back to the tradition. And I do believe that many of this reaction is exactly according to this line. And this is why I very much agree with Grzegorz that from this point of view, it's not simply past dependency on the level of the institutions, and they are quite clear. For example, there was quite an interesting article being written to what extent Mr. Kaczynski's idea of law and the role of law come from the debates in Poland in the 1960s and 1970s, kind of a Schmittianism from the left, the popular will and so on. But I do believe this is important because, and this is my last point with this, I am very much afraid that these big political collapses has the logic of an accident. You have things basically that on the level of timing, certain policies cannot go easily together. And nevertheless, that I very much agree that, for example, the refugee crisis very much is changing the perspective of Germany on economic policies. And by the way, giving even the legal way of Germany to go to redistribute without breaking its major principle. Mainly, if you're going to allow the countries, the governments, to get their refugee spendings out of their budget deficit of the 3% limit, you're giving flexibility in the economic system without changing the rules.
Yeah.
So from this point of view, you have a lot of this which can work there, but in order for this to work, you need a lot of, not political leadership in the way of will, but of fine-tuning and kind of negotiations, and here there is a major difference between the political culture of the different countries. I don't believe that Eastern Europe wants to get out of the European Union. By the way, Mr. Orban does not want to get out of the EU. For his regime to survive, you need two things: European funds and anti-European rhetoric. You deprive him of one of them, and the system cannot work. But the interesting story is that now everybody is trying to remake the Europe in the way he believes. And this remaking is not by writing 5 scenarios like Juncker's, but it is basically trying to influence the behavior of the others. And this is where I see the real risk. Basically, collapse as a traffic accident between this crisis, dancing with each other.
Yeah.
Let's open the floor, please.
Hi, my name is Marianne Rouillet. I'm a professor of political science, and I teach a class on global Europe at the Kennedy School. Thank you very much for both your presentations. They are very inspiring in different ways. Even I would like to push you to to do a bit more policy than you do. I mean, I think somehow Kim captured well the fact that symbolic politics matters maybe much more than it does, really. And my question to you was, so, okay, you point to real problems, and as an Eastern European, you actually do it much better than we Western Europeans could picture that. You remind me of Timothy Snyder, who was recently here presenting his book on tyranny, saying that he could foresee what happened here because he had been trained by Eastern European mentors, and maybe that's lacking in Western Europe. And by the way, I'm French.
Okay.
But so what policies could address the problems that you mentioned? Do you think some policies could redress, maybe simple things about reducing unemployment, giving more hope to people? Because I think we are all very geared towards maximalist symbolic issues, but there's also a political debate to have about Europe, which is criticizing Europe. It's okay, it's legitimate, as long as Europe does stupid things, and Europe did stupid things. So for that, I really thank you, Kim, because I think you frame things in a way that is hopeful, and maybe it's misleading, although my question to both of you would be, do you think there could be a new French moment in Europe, or a Southern moment? You like to speak in terms of moment. So that would be, if France behaves well, can we start a new logic with social Europe, political planning, more politics and progressive politics, especially since Germany might turn left soon, so the alliance could work well again. Thanks.
Kim,
Well,
it's a
so-
serious question. You should start.
Well, you could start. But I do think that, I don't think we're going to get a French moment, actually. I mean, just on your direct question. I think what we're seeing, actually, is something that was inevitable from 1990 on, which is that Germany is too big for the EU. So what we're starting to see now is the emergence of a different kind of politics, where you've got the Visegrad countries, you've got the Benelux countries. It's been a little slow to get all of the pigs, like not Ireland, but sort of Greece, Italy, Spain, Portugal together. I think what we're going to see going forward in the EU are blocs that counter Germany, so that Germany, which is the reluctant leader, right, will not have to be the reluctant leader. There'll be other leadership. And the question is where France fits into this. France has been so absent for a while, worried about its own politics. Yeah. Yeah, no, and we're if the French election goes for Le Pen, much of my optimism is unwarranted, because that's huge. But I'm hopeful that this won't happen. Can I say something just in response to Grzegorz comment before, which is, those of us who work on Eastern Europe have been caught up in post-communism for a long time, and I've been trying to urge everybody to think about post-communism. I think what we're seeing now is not the reaction to communism, it's a reaction to what got us out of communism, right? And that was because liberalism, economic and political liberalism, got fused as an option. And when economic liberalism, caused a huge amount of pain, it killed off political liberalism forever. There will not be a liberal party in that part of the world for a generation, because everybody thinks it's the same thing. So I think that's one reason why we're seeing some of the collapses we're seeing in Eastern Europe. It's because of post-communism, not communism. And on the question about like the frozen, I've always loved that metaphor of like communism just froze everything. But here's the other frozen metaphor, which is I'd spent some time in Mongolia, and there was this point when Mongolia unfroze, when they said, we're nomads, like that's our culture, we're going to do this. And because Mongolia had such an economy that it just collapsed, a lot of people actually became nomads. They got animals, they got, yurts, and they kind of went out. And the tragic thing, right, was the first time they got a really bad winter, lots of people literally froze to death. There were tens of thousands of people who froze to death. And that's because they didn't really know how to be nomads. And I think the same thing about all these other frozen conflicts, right? Like, what we now see is old believers in Russia, another group I hang out with. They don't even know what old believerism is about. They have no clue about the history. I think we're seeing this with a lot of the religious movements, that what this is the recovery of a shell of something without the something. And so that means it's kind of ultimately fragile, but it's ultimately also extremely mobile, right? It can attach itself to all kinds of things that weren't in the original. And so that's why I think that a lot of the fights that we think of as the big, serious, worry, scary fights are fights over occupation of this cultural space, which is important. It's really desperately important. But it's also a fight over the cultural space, which is to say that one of the counters may be thinking of different kinds of cultural logics that engage it rather than trying to suppress it. Because then, the attempt to freeze it again will, I think, really, be where we get another round of fights.
Thank you for the question. And I very much hope that they're going to be a French moment. Just give three. First, I always found Daniel Roderick's globalization trilemma interesting way to frame the choices. Like every framing, it's a radical one and so on. But when it comes to politics, European project is much more radical than people believe. Imagine the economic crisis of 28-29, and you're going to see that the world ended with two different types of there is no alternative regimes. In European Union, the idea is there is no policy alternative. We constitutionalize budget deficit in the way we constitutionalize human rights. So from this point of view, the major economic decisions were taken out of the electoral politics, and what remained in electoral politics was identity issues and foreign policy identity related. This is a radical change. In places like China and Russia, you have the other thing. They're very flexible on policy issues, but there is no political alternative. You can change policies as much as you want if you're not touching the people who are deciding. I'm saying this because in a certain way, one of the degrading effect of the European integration was that some of the sources of the current populism, particularly among the young and pro-European voters, was the fact that you can play with the political system and nothing really bad is going to happen. Let's give Bulgaria an example, because on pessimism I didn't give anything Bulgarian and I feel obliged to do it. Listen, from a political scientist point of view, Bulgaria is an amazingly incredible country, or interesting country. We have such an electoral volatility that you're going to be shocked. Starting with the year 2001, twice for this period, a party that had been created 6 months before the election is winning majority in the parliament. First was the king, then the bodyguard of the king. So Bulgaria had been governed from the left, from the right, from above, from below. Why this is possible? Why political loyalty is so low? Because you believe that you can punish the system, but you're not going to punish yourself because the European safety net exists. You can elect any idiot you want because the European Union is not going to allow him to do something which is truly idiotic. So you start to use basically voting only as signaling. When you have a generation of voters who think in terms of signaling, it's very difficult to get these progressive moments that you're talking about. And secondly comes the, for me, this is a very important issue. If Germany and France, and I know that many people dream for Schulz being elected and Macron at the same time, this is going to be the split of Europe. All these East European governments we're talking about, they can live with the Macron-Chancellor Merkel combination, hating it, but they're not going to live with the Schulz-Macron combination because the clash between East and West is going to be wrongly framed as the clash between the left and the right. I was trying to figure out why Mr. Orban is doing what he's doing now with Central European University, because listen, the idea to close a university, if you are not crazy, and he's not crazy, should be part of a much more deliberative strategy. And I do believe his strategy is to recapture the European People's Party. Because if Mrs. Merkel is going to lose the elections, the only powerful and ambitious center-right political leader who remains in the EPP is Mr. Orban. French center-right is hiring his wife, so he's not going to do very well. Probably he can do better, I don't know, but Italian center-right does not exist. Spanish center-right, basically for them, the other side of the world is Barcelona. No of them has the Nordic are not in the game because they are not perceived as center-right for the others. So from this point of view, you end up with the situation in which these differences are going to become very radical. And I don't believe that European is going to have enough political space to balance this. I do believe that, strangely enough, Merkel-Macron combination is going to be much easier to be politically, and this is not how people are voting. This is not about ideological preferences, what I'm saying. And this is the problem. In order for Europe to work, for what you are saying to work, for what Kim is saying to work, you need such a constellation. You need a good luck.
But why EPP would be the something he's so much interested in?
Because, first of all, he had, to be honest, Orban is quite interesting because he had an ambition and he has a strategy. His strategy is basically to use the migration issue to basically recapture the voters that went to the far right. And as we talked on the lunch, he's doing in his foreign policy what he did in his domestic politics. He managed to create a very strong hegemonic discourse and hegemonic position for Fidesz. In order to do it, you should also try to create a right that is a much more awful than you are, so you're going to keep your position in the center. And here comes the role Poland is playing. He basically helped for Mr. Tusk to be re-elected, so very much strengthening his mainstream credentials. So you have the crazy Pole, not crazy Poles, but the crazy Polish government. And then you have this strange, slightly aggressive, but basically mainstream Orban, who is interested to campaign for others. What people are underestimating is how much time he's spending to go to help other center-right leaders, particularly in the countries on the Balkan road, Bulgaria, Serbia, Macedonia, and others. because for him, keeping these governments is the way to protect his borders from migrants. And I do believe this is a clear strategy. This is a certain idea of Europe which is trying to push, exactly because he does not want to leave Europe. He needs a particular type of a fortress Europe. In this fortress Europe, redistribution is going to have certain dimension, but he basically knows that it's not going to be so easy because he does not believe in all these cosmopolitan projects. His major constraint is the 60% of the export of Hungary is for German companies. So he cannot confront Germany because there is a reality. But this is also, we very much underestimate the sophistication of some of these political regimes. People say how corrupt this government is and how unfriendly it is to the investors. Let's put it, it is selectively corrupt, and this is selectively unfair. Talk to some of the big investors who are creating jobs, particularly in the underdeveloped areas in Hungary, and they're going to tell you how helpful the government is and how much they're not allowing any corruption pressure on the middle and the lower level. So from this point of view, I do believe, and this is probably some of the difference, I really very much believed in events that are shaping policies. So from this point of view, the structural trend that both of you are putting, I do believe it is real. Mm-hmm. And this is why I'm never going to say it's over. Also, Machiavelli has a very good point on this. He said there is no logic ever to surrender because you don't know what the fortune has prepared for us. So if you're lucky, you can do it.
Can I add one thing on Orban? Actually, while we're on Orban and the foreign policy, that I agree with that completely, and I want to just pile on one thing, which is Orban, I used to think that Orban was not going to play a role in European politics. He's done this. So the question is why he stepped up to that stage. And as you know, we've all been saying, the EU now has punitive sanctions around budget matters. And Hungary, because it's driven away a lot of foreign investors, really has a serious budget problem. So the question is how Orban gets out from under those sanctions. And what he's been doing is flying around the world, making deals with dictators that don't care if he's a dictator. So he's signed deals. I mean, there's been a big fuss about the deal he signed with Russia, which is for obvious symbolic reasons, but the bigger deals are with China, with the Emirates, with Saudi, with all the Central Asian oil-rich states from Turkmenistan on. So there are all of these deals that Orban's made, and I keep thinking, what is he selling them? And I think what he's selling them is a combination of disrupting the EU, right, playing bad boy, trying to make it weaker and weaker because all these countries benefit from a weak EU. And the other thing, I mean, he may be also selling information from inside the most exclusive clubs in the world, which he's part of, but all these companies are now giving money to the Hungarian government to hold it up, right? So what I think Orban wants to do is not to have such scrutiny over the Hungarian budget. So he's pulling a Margaret Thatcher. If you remember, one of the things Thatcher was always in favor of to do her UK Eurosceptical thing was to keep enlarging the EU, because the bigger it is, the less integration there is. And so Orban is going to become, for the migration reason, but also for this other reason, an advocate of bringing in all of former Yugoslavia and extending. In fact, he was the one who was making trips to Kiev at one point to try to talk to Ukraine about accession. I mean, Orban's made a deal with Turkey, which is, anyway. So Orban sees himself now as the ambassador to the potential new accession states, precisely so that the EU becomes weaker and weaker.
I very much agree. And by the way, this explains, because people normally, because normally I'm doing much more Russia than Europe. So if people normally always believe that it is the big countries that totally instrumentalize the small countries, and the small countries basically don't play games. In the case of Orban, in many respects, he instrumentalized the Russians. Yes. Because he's much more interested than them in certain type of policies and things. Russians have these days quite a lot of preoccupations globally. So from this point of view, it's quite important. He went to the Russians and the Chinese because he didn't want to go back to the IMF. After he had this banking reform, this is very clear. This is basically not based on research, but this was clear in a conversation with the senior Hungarian officials. They said, we cannot allow to go back to the IMF because the banks are going to take a revenge on us. So we are ready to get money from anywhere which is not International Monetary Fund. And I do believe that, but this is exactly the strategies that I'm talking about. This is this type of hedging. And this is why he really has the behavior of a hedge fund manager, taking a lot of risk, playing a lot of risk and being ready to disrupt the system in order basically to get leverage.
Right. It's true.
Thank you so much. This was so interesting and very thought-provoking, and also very nice to hear the Central Eastern European perspective in the center, which is not very often present, but when it's present, it's very good. I'm Polish. My name is Aleksandra Sojka. I'm a visiting scholar here at the Center for European Studies, and I have a question about what the future will be for European integration, taking into account all your wonderful explanations about why we are stuck in where we're stuck right now, and especially about the future for Central Eastern Europe. Because right now we see all these conversations within the EU with the white paper about like where we should go from now, how should we fix things, and it seems that this idea of differentiated integration is the way that it's going to go, basically. So I wonder, in terms of how Central Eastern Europe is positioned now, thanks to Mr. Orban, Mr. Kaczynski, which is not, I think, representative of the public opinion. Where is the public opinion on it, which you very rightly pointed out. I wonder what can save Central Eastern Europeans as European citizens from becoming totally again, periphery of Western Europe.
So now we have an easy question.
My answer is, in a certain way, Poland is going to be the critical thing, and how political developments. Paradoxically, I do believe that France and Poland are the two countries that are going to matter in the next year and a half, for a very simple reason. For example, nobody can understand German policy towards Russia for the last 3 years if he does not know that this was Germany's Polish policy. For the Germany, in order to have a deepening of the integration, it was so important to convince the Poles that Poland mattered for them more than Russia, because traditionally in the Polish imagination, it was always the Russian German. So this is why Merkel went on a sanction regime. This is why was this pressure, because they knew that this is a big country and the integration, because what it means Poland to be convinced, it means that Poland is even ready to go for the Eurozone, Poland is ready to go for the common army, and to be honest, after Trump was elected, even the current government signaled to the Germans that they're ready to go for the common European army. So this is one place. The other is France. Germany cannot do it on its own. And also, Germany does not have a legitimacy to do it on its own. Germany does not have the elites that are going to ready to do it on its own. And also, the German business model is very strange, because Germany is not a country that trades so much within Europe. The biggest trading partner for Germany is outside of Europe. The biggest investment partner is here. So from this point of view, Germany is the only global player now when Britain is out within the European Union, when all others, including France, is very much Europe-centered. So, and Germany believes that they can make a deal with the UK much more around the security terms and basically having some market access for the security guarantees. And this is a reconfiguration of Europe. If Poland, as a result of domestic political developments of something, is going to reposition itself, it is one game. But from this point of view, Mr. Kaczynski is very different than Mr. Orban. Mr. Orban is a political opportunist. If he believes that his strategy does not work, he will readjust. Mr. Kaczynski will not readjust. He's an honest man. He does not take bribes. I'm saying without irony this. In Eastern Europe, if we talk money, I do believe that none of these European leaders is less interested in money than the leader, Mr. Kaczynski. But as a result of it, he's very difficult for the European politics, because he really comes from a different time dimension. And this is why I do believe really the Polish and the French questions are going to be the one, because on the base of how the French and the Polish questions are going to be solved, we're going to have one Germany or another Germany. If the French question is solved and the Polish is not, we're going to have consolidation of the Eurozone at the expense of the periphery. If the Polish question is going to be solved and the French is not going to be solved, we're going to have the consolidation of the German economic zone, because Poland is very much of the supply chain of the German economy. But if both are not going to be solved, then for Germany, the problem, do we have an interest in the European Union, which is more integrated, in my view, is becoming a legitimate question.
Okay. Yeah, so just on East Central Europe and differentiated, the differentiated way forward, like which everyone knows everyone's in favor of, but still we're supposed to have a debate about it. So I think among the many reasons for differentiated Europe is that it's the only way forward. But there's another reason which I think, I've been sort of hearing among Commission people, which is that they've realized suddenly that they can't discipline Hungary and Poland. They have no negative sanctions to offer. I mean, first of all, because now that you have two countries, they veto each other's Article 7, but they couldn't even figure out a way to bring logical infringement actions, or, because both Hungary and Poland figured out ways to misbehave just over the line of EU law into national legal, responsibility. So the EU sees, I think, or rather the Commission, I should say, because not the Council, but the Commission sees one of its biggest threats as the kind of moral disintegration of Europe, that it becomes a purely economic project with no values. And they have been, I mean, even though they look inactive, but behind the scenes they've done a ton of stuff. And they're very frustrated that they don't have more tools for handling these outlier countries, which are, basically, an anathema to European values. So this is one reason why they're in favor of differentiation. Because if there's an inner circle that these countries, which are now in the inner circle, are excluded from, what they're hoping is that it will generate a backlash among the citizens to get rid of these governments. Because if there's something, for which now these countries will become disqualified, the idea is that that produces enough churn in the political system to get rid of these governments. I don't know that they're right about that. I think they're more right about that in Poland, where there's a very strong opposition and there's still civil society, there's still free media, compared to Hungary, where 500,000 Hungarians have left in the last 6 years, and it's all the cosmopolitans, because Orban found a way to aim all the austerity programs at all of his enemies. So literally, if you're from a family where any one member has opposed the regime, none of the family members can get jobs. So Orban, got rid of 500,000 people who would have voted against him. Then he imported 500,000 people who were sort of right-wing Hungarians from neighboring states, and that's how he got elected last time. There were a million, it was a swap out of like 1 million people. So anyway, the reason why I say all of this is that, Orban is, I think, much more ruthless. But I think also that people will really rise up against him, including his own Fidesz supporters, if it looks like there's something that's going to deprive them of being in an inner circle. I think that's what the CEU debate is about. Suddenly, there's a huge outcry from really important people. The Nobel laureates, some of you, I think Poland's a bit the same way, but, the Budapest Tourism Board, the first time it got a chance to make a tourism booklet in 1992, said, Hungary, land of more Nobel Prize winners per capita than any place else. And I remember saying to them, for most people, that's not a draw, actually. Maybe the people in this room, but not in general. But when 14 Nobel laureates wrote this letter last week that said CEU is important, I think that was important. So what you see is that the EU has realized it doesn't have the negative tools. So this is its strategy for bringing these countries back into line, completely apart from it's the only other way forward.
We have very little time left, so let me collect the questions now, the remaining ones, and then I will get back to you. So Stella, please.
Thank you very much, Stella Gervas, and thank you very much for sharing with us your very challenging thoughts. So I am eager to read Ivan's book, but in the meantime I read your excellent article on the anatomy of resentment in the volume Rethinking Europe, to which I also contributed. So I would like to ask a provocative moral question about migrations. If we asked to, say, a Martian to briefly read a modern history of Europe and to decide what is the most evil as the political ideologies that Europe ever produced, what would he answer? Perhaps the ethnic purity, the ideologies of ethnic purities. And after all, we have all the devastations of Europe in 1945. So, is this migration phenomenon really a political crisis of the European Union, or rather a moral challenge for Europe as a space of civilization? So I make as a historian this distinction between Europe and the European Union. Perhaps we Europeans have to face the fact that migrations and multiculturalism are natural phenomena, and that I would say that the ethnically homogeneous nation states are artificial creations. And we have these examples, especially in Central Europe and Eastern Europe, these states. Since this is a result of horrible massacres and deportations, perhaps the migration is just an attempt of the Mother Nature to establish this human diversity of Europe. So could that be a signal for historians, for political scientists, for scholars in general, to ask a really disturbing question? Has the time come for the Europeans to question the moral legitimacy of ethnically homogeneous states? Like they have already questioned, for example, colonialism or slavery.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Stella. One more question.
Thank you all for this very interesting and thought-provoking talk. And I actually found one of the arguments Professor Scheppele brought very interesting, namely the fact that the UK's leaving the Union now creates an opportunity for deeper integrations in many areas that, in which deeper integration has until recently been unthinkable. And I believe you mentioned common corporate tax, creating fiscal capacity to address asymmetric shocks and so on. The white paper about the future of the EU has also been mentioned, which also envisages deeper integration. And I wonder, how does this translate in the field of national politics? Do you think, speaking of changes in perspectives, how crises change perspectives, do you think this would create a room for a different rhetoric that sees integration, not disintegration, as part of the solution to national problems that can compete with the populism and nationalism, particularly in those troubled democracies in Eastern Europe, such as Poland and Hungary?
Thank you. So it's back to you.
You want to? Okay, well, so and this is actually really interesting. So I do think that national politics, I mean, the worry is that national politics become ever more cultural, right? Because all these other issues are taken out of their space. And this is why, you know, in Hungary it's always a fight over the statue to the latest raving anti-Semite that they've dug up and renamed a national poet. So, and then everybody goes and protests the statue. In the meantime, they pass a law that closes all the NGOs. So, I mean, so anyway, there is this kind of sense in which cultural politics are a very specific kind of politics, in which it's extremely hard to find compromises, and in which people manufacture past to support the present. And so it seems to me that part of what I think would need to be done to national politics if Europe were to integrate more is to try to figure out really how to construct a European democratic space. Right? This has been the sort of Habermas dream, and you know, Dieter Grimm saying, no, it's not possible. The wrong thing to do right now is exactly what the EU just did, which is to abolish Euronews. Right? That at some level, what we really need are more pan-European platforms. There's now a proposal on the table with Brexit's departure. It'll leave 73 seats in the European Parliament, and everybody wants to grab them. But what if we have a vote for party lists at the European level? In other words, it could be that if Europe becomes more integrated, that national politics will become less central. But then we've got to build a place for real contestation at the European level, because right now there's not such a space. So I think with all these other forms of integration we're talking about, we've also got to think about where's the space for real democratic debate. And that may have to move, or at least be duplicated at the European level and not just left to the national level.
Yeah, thank you. I'll go on your, and this is absolutely great question. And here's the stories, and if we go back to the European project, its very success now is part of its problem. Because European success was a kind of a trying to remake invisibly Europe. So the legacy of the nation state was never morally challenged. What was challenged was the Nazi view of the nation state, but all of the nation states were not. In a different countries, from this point of view, Miller's book on rescuing European state is important not simply in policy terms, but European integration was never kind of a clash with the idea of a national identity and others. It was always reaffirmed. And now, in a very short period of time, because the timing issue is there, yes, I do believe that diversity is going to be restored, nevertheless we want it or not. One of the things that scares people is exactly this understanding that in a certain way, how you're fighting, by the way, demography. What exactly you're doing. And don't forget, we talk here about migration, but there is another fear. And this is why the change of society, it's not only European. I can see a very similar processes in the United States. You have technology kind of dystopia on one side with all these robots and others. I always wanted to have a global survey. If people ask what they prefer to work with, robot or foreigner, and secondly, who they prefer to be taken care of when they're old, you're going to see a lot of national differences. Japanese made their choice. They'll go with the robots. But why I'm saying that this is, the problem is, and here's where part of my pessimism comes. We did an opinion poll after the last European elections in the 14 EU member states, only with the people between 19 and 35, trying to see basically how they react on certain issues. The younger generation is much more liberal when it comes to the lifestyle issues. For example, when it comes to the gay rights and others, major generation difference. There was only one country in Europe, and this was Hungary, where the majority of the people were against gay marriages. I mean, this generation. When it comes to migration and foreigners, there was no difference between generations. Part of it is economic insecurity. Part of it is that the problem with the national narrative is that you have an agent to tell it, and this is the state. European Union, and I, like everybody, being from time to time frustrated with the Commission, particularly the impossibility to play a hard ball. But if you don't have a constituency, you cannot play a hard ball. Because in order to have a hard ball, you should have a place where you can go back to. And this is the weakness of the Commission. By the way, very competent, well-intended people. To be honest, much more meritocratic elites than anybody else, because these people really made it. If you see East Europeans who did it, humble background just based on education, but they cannot play a hard ball in Macedonia, not that they cannot play it in Hungary and Poland. And some of these countries, Poland is a big country. You don't know how it's going to react. The interesting story was, according to the opinion polls, the majority of the polls were against all this pressure on the Constitutional Court. At the same time, the majority of the polls were against the European Commission telling them how to deal with the crisis of the Constitutional Court. So from this point of view, I do believe you are asking a question which cannot be resolved in 10, 15 years. I don't believe that we're going to kind of not to face this question. The fact that most of East European countries were not colonial empires create this type of a moral comfortable situation in which we said, listen, we are now threatened by imperial power, because for Bulgarians, Turkey is an imperial power, and by post-imperial policies. So even this narrative is not easy. You don't have a colonization debate in places like Bulgaria. I don't know how it's Poland or Hungary, but in Poland it's probably the same as Bulgaria, simply Russia plays the Turkish role.
Yeah.
Okay, please join me to thank Ivan and Kim for fascinating discussion, and I think we are going to have more of it in coming years, but the next one is next week. We'll welcome here Justice Rzepliński, who was this defender of the Polish Constitutional Tribunal against Kaczynski government. So he is coming here on Thursday for a Zaleski lecture. So please come for that event. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. Thank you.